Are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for giving some time tonight. We're going to give it a few more minutes, see if some more people get on, and we'll begin the presentation. Once again, good evening to everybody who joined us. We'll get started in another couple minutes or so. We want to see if we can get some more people in the room before we begin. All righty, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully more people will join as we move along. Next slide, please. So the first slide we have, folks, in case you need closed captioning, either for hearing impaired or you'd like to read it in Spanish, here are the directions on here. I'll leave it up for another couple minutes. I'd like to note also that if you are using the Spanish option, when we get to the Q&A section, you can actually type in your questions in Spanish and we will be answering those. A couple things also, tonight is being recorded. A recording, a copy of the recording will be posted on the project page next week, so you can come back and watch. And as a slide that will be shown later, we will be accepting questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature. So once again, let's give it another minute. Hopefully some other people get on, and this is how you use the closed captioning. Alrighty, next slide, please. So again, welcome. My name is Rob Robinson. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager for the City of Gaithersburg. Joining me this evening is Greg Mann, our Community Planning Manager, and my counterpart in the Planning Department. And from the city side, we're overseeing the Retool project. Also joining us from our consultant team, ZoneCo, is Jocelyn Gibson, Project Manager, who you will hear a lot more from this evening. And Christopher Myers is one of the project planners for this project. And we may or may not hear from Christopher later on. So, but he is here and he is diligently tracking the questions that hopefully you guys will be submitting. Next slide, please. And again, we're here. Yes. So Retool Gaithersburg, what is it? So Retool Gaithersburg is the name we're giving to our zoning code update project. And what we're doing, and this is an effort to revise our zoning code, chapter 24 of the city code, so it can better meet community goals, can be more understandable and easier to use, and really focuses on making sure equity is considered and addressed throughout zoning. Just as important of what is Retool is what it is not. Retool Gaithersburg is not the master plan. It will not make land use recommendations for your individual businesses or homes. It will not change approved development plans. Just because potentially something changes, you're not going to have to come back and demo your house to meet a new potential setback. You're not going to have to sell a car because you might not meet the parking standard any longer. So Retool Gaithersburg will not be retroactive on existing developments. Any changes to the zoning ordinance you will only have to comply with if you make a physical change or submit something. New plans, if you want to build an addition, if you want to add a fence, if you want to open a business, then the new restrictions under a new zoning ordinance will come into effect. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn to tell you about, so she can tell you about this evening's topic, the diagnostic report. So go ahead and take it away, Jocelyn.
Great. Thank you, Rob. So we'll just start off with a project timeline, just kind of let you know where we are in the project. So you'll see on your screen that there's a graphic that just kind of gives it a sort of general conceptual view. So we started off with a public project kickoff a few months ago, and once we had that kickoff meeting, we were doing a lot of analysis of this existing zoning code, which really fed into this report that that we're reviewing tonight, that is also available on the website. So that's where we are right now in spring of 2023. We're kind of wrapping up the sort of number 2 place in the graphic, identification of code revisions. And I do want to remind you that everything you hear tonight, from what you read about the report on the website, you can still give us feedback. If there's an issue that you've encountered that you want to make sure is denoted, please feel free to provide some feedback via the website, and there is a special email address for this project, so we will be checking that. So do feel free to reach out. And so once we're through the diagnostic and this public presentation of the diagnostic and making final revisions from any final feedback that comes back through this effort right now, we'll be getting into some more specific ideation and assessment of how exactly things should change now that we have an idea of what sort of really the shortcomings are, and we've heard from the community, and we've heard from some stakeholders and staff. So we'll be really looking into sort of what we call kind of calibration of some standards and the ways that they're going to change moving forward. And we'll obviously be getting feedback on that. I always use 2 words to describe that process. It's collaborative and it's iterative. The communities know the places that they live, the spaces that they frequent so intimately. They know it better than anybody else. So it is really helpful in a genuine way to receive feedback from a community, especially when we get into the specific details of how the code might change through this update. And then we get into drafting the full code and some public hearing processes, which will get us into spring of 2024. So I do want to remind you that there is a Q&A button on your toolbar. There's sort of a little graphic that presents that. So please feel free at any point in the presentation, if there is a question that you would like to ask, and if you want to ask it while you're thinking of it, we'll be sort of consolidating all the questions and we'll be answering them at the end. We do also have someone from the city that is on the call that's able to answer questions in Spanish. So please also feel free to ask Spanish language questions as well. So getting into the zoning diagnostic report. So what is a zoning diagnostic report? As I kind of talked about, it is the first step in the zoning code update process. So diagnose is kind of a medical term. So to really understand how the code could be updated or revised, you first have to diagnose what's wrong with it. So that's sort of the first step, like what are the shortcomings and what are the things that really need to be improved upon, revised, updated. So that's sort of in a nutshell why we call it the diagnostic report. And it also helps to orient the project. It's just a good first step the team collaborating and familiarizing. In the zoning code is a quite complex document. They tend to be quite long, so really familiarizing with the complexity of the document too. And going through it with a fine-tooth comb. So we don't just go into the into analyzing the diagnostic report without some guidance from the community. Can't go in and say, this is what we think without understanding what the community even wants to begin with. So there is some guidance from things like the strategic plan, best practices in zoning. We as consultants, we work in a lot of other communities, so we have exposure to a lot of different types of zoning codes, a lot of different types of issues that you see in zoning codes and different types of solutions. So we can apply a little bit of that. However, it's important to note that every community is different. All of the solutions that you come up with have to be contextual to that community, and that's where also your feedback as the public is very important, to make sure that we're getting it right, to make sure that it's both reflective of the community, it respects the existing urban fabric that's already there. So those are some important things. So long range plans also can really help provide a lot of guidance, and they're kind of a pulse check with long range plans tend to have really large, robust public engagement components to them. So, they reflect goals for land use from the community. So the report structure, just to give an overview, you can go onto the website and you can see the full draft of the report. Introduction, guiding principles, strategic plan objectives, general observations, analysis, and recommendations. So, we'll be reviewing most of these things tonight. It is a very dense report. If you go onto the website and you see it, it's it's maybe 60, 70 pages. So, that's a lot of material to cover. So we'll try to do that succinctly tonight, and in a way that doesn't put people to sleep, ideally. So we'll get into some of these individual sections. So as I was talking about, it's really important that when you're coming in and reviewing a zoning code, you understand where the community is starting from, you understand the community's context, you understand what their land use goals are. So the guiding principles are some sort of general sort of guideposts that help us in the review of what we should be looking for. Zoning should regulate only what needs to be regulated. It should respect both existing and desired development patterns. It should be an implementation of the master plan, again, reflective of the community's objectives. Ensure compliance with Maryland Code land use article. That's very important. You want in all facets your zoning code to be legally defensible and in keeping with state enabling legislation. And zoning should also center equity. And then, so going over to the strategic plan objectives. So there's a recently completed strategic plan in the city of Gaithersburg, and so that it is also a sort of a large document, and we have distilled some of the land use goals from that plan to kind of guide our review of the report in a way that is reflective and in keeping with stated community goals. So now we're just going to get into some of the general observations from the report. I will denote that when it comes to zoning and it comes to a topic that can be quite dense, maybe a little specific, esoteric, it's important that we both keep it high level, so we're not getting too into the weeds, but we don't want to skip over anything and not get into the weeds enough and not give you enough detail. So this is where asking your questions, if something comes to your mind, is important. Again, I'll just remind you of the Q&A button. So moving into some of the general observations. So organization usability, we had a lot of observations related to this. One thing is, with zoning standards, a lot of them are numeric. A lot of them can be sort of distilled into a table format. So, if you think about yourself looking for information about your zoning district, about your property, and you might be looking for your front, side, rear setback. This is something you need to know. If you could find that information in a table, versus looking through long passages of text, you can kind of understand why that's easier and more accessible to find that information. So making sure that we're presenting that information in tables, we're removing text where possible, and just making it really clear for people. And then further to that, having visual aids and graphics. So this can really assist with understanding, like visualizing the standards and where they apply. So when we're referring to a standard, a zoning standard in the code, you can provide a graphic that shows someone exactly sort of how it applies on the site, on their property. So that's another thing that you can do to make a code more usable. There are currently very few graphics within the zoning code, almost none at all. So that's something that we can implement as we go through the code update. Also something for just organization usability. This happens in other communities where we work, where for whatever reason, some zoning districts are developed, but they're never mapped. They're never applied anywhere. So it's a zoning district that just doesn't apply to anything. It's just additional text in the document that is making it sort of more laborious to read and navigate. So removing some of those zoning districts can just make the code more readable and usable overall. So language and consistency. This was particular, there were a lot of instances of this in the Gaithersburg code where language is used inconsistently. A term might be, term or a concept might be in several different sections, but it's stated inconsistently in each of those sections. And so, that gets challenging for the user. It gets challenging for the person who's trying to administer the code. And so, that's something that's important to revise when we're going through the code update. And so in addition to the language being a bit inconsistent, the way that information could be presented in sections that are similar, like when you're looking at zoning districts and you're looking for the information for each zoning district, that information is presented inconsistently. So if you're flipping through and trying to understand what different regulations are in different districts, you have to look in different places, and just standardizing that can just make it a more usable, user-friendly code. So that's another thing to focus on for the update. Some terms are dated. We see this in codes that haven't been updated in some time. It'll sort of apply to some commercial uses that just kind of don't exist anymore. Further to that, oftentimes you'll see modern land uses that just are absent because they sort of existed post adoption of the code, maybe, which could be 30 years old. So that's something to just be attuned to, making sure that the types of uses and the types of ways that people are using land are reflected in the code and accounted for. And then so definitions, there are many absent definitions, or sometimes they're too broad. They're not giving enough specificity to interpret the code effectively. So and again, other things to focus on for the update. So procedural clarity. So with procedures, when you've got applicants, putting forth applications for zoning approvals, the procedures just need to be explained in a way that's going to provide as much clarity as possible. So using terms that are vague, or processes that are vague, we just want to remove those, so that if you're applying for something, if you're going through site plan review, that everything is clear to you. You understand what the benchmark is, like what's the goal here, and how do I have to present this information? What are the benchmarks? So striking the right balance between discretionary approvals and certainty for zoning approvals. So there is one thing that is notable about the Gaithersburg zoning code is there are a lot of floating zones and waivers and things like this, which do provide a good amount of flexibility within the code, and those can be inherently positive things, but just making sure you're striking the right balance between giving some discretion, but also providing certainty for the applicant, so that they understand the standards that they need to meet for this particular application. And then also one thing that we observed and also heard is that some small amendments to plans within the MXD and the CD zone particularly can be very onerous. So small changes to a development plan are just the process is maybe more extensive and challenging than it needs to be, and time consuming. Zoning equity, so making sure that diverse housing types are represented and distributed throughout the city in a way that is thoughtful and context sensitive, but just making sure that we're thinking critically about the types of housing and where they're appropriate to locate them. Providing more housing to provide relief on the housing supply. So thinking about this critically, again, saying this, I think it doesn't always just mean like a blanket density. It's again, thoughtful and context sensitive, while also trying to provide a diversity of housing types and accessible housing for the people of Gaithersburg. So also just making sure that when we're looking at the zoning for communities, that we're thinking about the types of uses that the community members use and need, and making sure that we are permitting them. We are A, permitting them, because sometimes they're not even permitted, and B, we're just being thoughtful about the locations where they are permitted. And so that's twofold. That's making sure that they are in an accessible location, but also not putting them in an inappropriate location. So again, that's one area where you want to strike a balance, but we just want to be cognizant of that. Home occupations are another one where we just need to make sure that we're allowing them equitably across the city. And so something else to be conscious of there. So the next one pertaining to grocers, urban agriculture, farm stands, community gardens. Sometimes in zoning codes, these things aren't even listed. And so, in many zoning codes, they'll have a provision that says if a use is not listed, is not permitted. But these things really can impact food deserts in communities, and just making sure that there is access to fresh food. And so that's another thing to be conscious of. And then also making sure we've got flexibility for smaller scale and nimble commercial uses that could apply to small scale entrepreneurs, minority business owners. So just making sure that the zoning code is not facilitating the type of environment where you have to have a large minimum lot size. You need, you've got X amount of lot coverage that leads to maybe an inefficient use of land that kind of maybe favors a larger entity. And so just making sure that we're creating opportunities within commercial zoning for those types of things. We have communities that just want to make sure that the type of venue where someone could have a stall, sort of low capital commercial opportunities are available. So that is a kind of broad thing. Some places are exploring pop-up shops and making sure that there's facility for that. So this is kind of broad, and it's kind of new, and there's a lot of people who work in the economic development space that are studying these types of things, but just making sure we're not creating barriers for the smallest business owners. So we're getting into here the more section-based analysis that occurred section by section of the code. So some of the recommendations in here, again, we're trying to strike that balance between giving you granularity and explaining the granularity of the analysis while not getting too into the weeds, because it's very easy to do with zoning. It's a very detailed, sort of oriented document once you get into it. So you can, again, you can go onto the website and you can read the full report. We've just sort of provided what that looks like, the button you can click on. It's under the project updates portion of the website. So these are getting into initial ZoneCo recommendations. So these are just a couple quick ones on diversity of accessible housing, some things we observed. So just making sure we're thinking critically about specific provisions that might be adding time or cost to projects that are providing housing, making sure that they are achieving the desired goals. So, it might be specific site standards, it might be, specific design standards that are applied to a specific housing type, and just making sure we're looking at those critically and they're not adding additional time and cost in a context of, needing to provide potentially, additional housing or additional diversity of housing types, which is things that are also reflected in the strategic plan. Evaluating accessory dwelling units, there's a fairly in-depth housing study that is currently being undertaken, and so it discusses this issue in greater detail. This was just sort of identifying that there isn't sort of a consistent strategy around ADUs. They're urban cottages and permitted in some districts, but we're just having a thoughtful approach and a context-sensitive approach where they can be permitted in appropriate locations in an appropriate way that sort of still leaves a cohesive built environment. Supporting infill and adaptive reuse, we did see some specific provisions that were maybe creating some barriers to shared parking. So shared parking, especially in relation to some of the economic development goals from the plan, shared parking arrangements can be important for, making the best use of your land resources. It's better for the aesthetics of the built environment. It's better for the environment itself. So just making sure that we are permitting that, and especially as it pertains to infill development too. that is an option, and it doesn't have any small provisions that are creating barriers around that. So there was a little bit of an assessment where the existing code might be creating some nonconformities that could be relieved within the new code. So instances where the code wasn't relational to what's on the ground, and so that building was made non-conforming, which is just going to kind of make some redevelopment challenging. So just making sure we're getting out ahead of that. So consider codifying changes where there waivers or variances are typically received. I do think the waivers provide some good flexibility within the code, but just making sure if it's a waiver that is sort of coming up constantly and constantly approved, that maybe that is something you can codify so it just becomes a permitted thing, whatever that might be. So, and then getting into more specificity around permitted uses. So this is a bit general. Again, we kind of mentioned this earlier in the presentation that sometimes there isn't a ton of clarity around which uses are permitted in which district. It might refer back to another district, which means that you can't just see, you look up your property to see if something is permitted on your property, and it says, okay, well, you can go look at this district to see, because it, it'll tell you if it's, and so just reducing that flipping back and forth and just making what's permitted in a given zoning district very clear for the user. So this is something that did kind of pop up in a few different zoning districts. When advancing equitable outcomes, so this is a very common thing around the United States for housing occupancy to be and how that is sort of regulated or enforced to being predicated upon a definition of family, which might specify number of blood relatives within a household. It can, there are different ways that communities might define it. However, what we were finding is defining family is very problematic. There's lots of different types of family relationships. There's lots of different types of householding units. I think probably across the United States, as housing costs increase, if they continue to increase, we'll see a diversity of different types of householding units across communities. And so defining family is problematic, and we are advising that be rethought and revised within the update. Removing instances of excessive minimum lot sizes. So just looking at, we had a question earlier about, people appreciate green space, they appreciate their yards, and we definitely understand that. We definitely relate to that. Just assessing where lot sizes can be reduced, just to allow some more housing to go in while not creating a stark urban environment. So just making sure it's context sensitive, but looking at minimum lot sizes critically. So we talked about this a little bit with the categories and definitions for small scale commercial uses that support entrepreneurs. So there are a list of uses that we can add to the use table in various commercial districts and mixed use districts that will just facilitate that. So those are some pretty specific changes. And then also in some of the more subjective review processes, there are some terms about, the objective through this review process is to assess X or Y. One of the terms is as an example, is caliber of user, which would be potentially a term subjective to whoever is reviewing, but that doesn't. And we can see the ways probably that there is some room for the way some that could be used in maybe a discriminatory way, and it just needs some more specificity around it. Increase the certainty of regulatory process. So again, we do recognize that this is a balance. There are a lot of flexible zoning districts within Gaithersburg, and that there's a lot of positivity in that. But there are some areas where there's a sort of burden of proof for what the person is trying to accomplish within the floating districts that can maybe create some uncertainty, and then also. Just making sure that there's enough certainty around those processes. But the flexibility is positive. We don't want that to go away. We just want to walk that line well, where we are explaining properly what people need to do for certain approval processes that are more subjective. Again, just looking at some terms like internally and externally compatible, just making sure we've got more clarity in the intent of that statement. And then also revise, simplify, and streamline site plan review processes, especially in the MXD and CD zones. So organization and usability. So we kind of talked about this earlier. There are some zones that aren't applied. So we can remove those and decrease the length of the code, the flipping around that someone might have to do. There's also room to consolidate zones that are substantially similar. That doesn't always look the same. It's not always throwing them together. Sometimes you might take an area with a bit of a different development pattern, and sort of you might create a specific development pattern district, or you could consolidate them. And so that when we get into the next phase, we'll be looking at things like that critically. And consolidate special use standards. Right now, they're kind of scattered throughout the document, the special use standards, and I believe there's some of them are in the definition section. So special use standards, if you've got a use that you just kind of want to make sure that there's additional buffering, or you want to, there's a special use standard applied to it, hours of operation, or something you'll see sometimes in codes. But just if you want a special use standard, a consolidated section can be an effective way for people can just go and defer to it there. Language and consistency. We did talk about this earlier, and so when we were looking at the section by section assessment, we didn't list them all here, but just where there's a lot of especially terms that were related to the use of property that are not used consistently. So that just needs to be dealt with. Ensure that some uses are listed, to make sure that they're listed. Things like standalone, a good example is parking lots and garages. That's a use that, although very needed in some instances, you just want to be conscious of making sure you do list them to assess whether they are permitted or not permitted. If you get too many surface parking lots in a given area, it can sort of degrade the urban environment. So just being really conscious about things like that. So procedural clarity, again, we've kind of hit on this a few times, and that is because there are these very flexible zones within the city. And so it does sort of, they're inherently a little less concrete than if you had a zoning district that just had straight zoning standards without the sort of review process built in that does provide more flexibility, but just consolidating some processes with with some general procedures in those sections, and just sort of assessing the ways that we can streamline that language. Ensure that all approvals are based on a clear pass-fail standards. This is easier said than done, but to the greatest degree possible, just try to ensure that there are well-defined expectations and understanding of application procedures. So what's next for this project after the diagnostic module? So we just reviewed at a pretty high level some of the recommendations. If you go into the report, you'll see it gets a bit granular, or it gets much more granular. But we next move into the calibrations. We've kind of assessed what's wrong and now, and what's not working. If you go into the report, there's actually, it denotes a lot of things that are working and are positive. So it's not all negative. But when we get into the next phase, we will be really assessing how things should change in a much more specific way. So as I said earlier, it is very important to hear from you. Again, the community members know the community better than anybody else, so your input is very valuable. So please keep a pace of the project, and as we get into the calibration phase, and so we'll just be looking at the specific changes that might occur in the update in just a much more granular way. Again, I like to say that it is a collaborative and it is an iterative process. So sometimes it's proposing solutions to problems, and sometimes there might be positive feedback, there might be negative feedback, and it's really important that the community weighs in on that. So please do. And so just to remind you that you can go to the project website. It's got project updates. It lets you know how you can be involved. It's got some educational materials in a few different ways. It shows you where there are resources related to the city of Gaithersburg. So it is really a good resource to stay abreast of what's going on in the project. Again, this diagnostic report and this presentation will be available on the project page as well. You can also follow on social media if that's your preferred way to sort of receive communication. So there is an sort of showing the different forms of social media there. And so I will open it up to questions now. And And so I will pass it off to my colleague, Christopher.
Thank you, Jocelyn. We have a question from the audience. Which other communities are we being compared with?
Well, I would say that you're not being compared to any communities because, you know, like this diagnostic report, we wouldn't have been able to anticipate what it was going to say before going in. So, you know, it's not, you know, the shared parking, let's say that's just something that came up in the assessment. So shared parking, we may have worked in other communities where they had some really specific solution for facilitating shared parking. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. It's not necessarily that you're being compared to any other community. It's just that, you know, and you've got your project team that has seen a lot of issues that have come up in Gaithersburg, your city project team. They're very familiar with zoning, the built environment in this community. And then you've got us, which we are learning this community, and it's not necessarily that you're being compared. It's more that we may have seen a solution in another community that we could propose, that we could say maybe this will work. But I would say comparison is not the right term to use.
A follow-up question. There's a lot of detail in the diagnostic report, and you've mentioned the project website, how to sign up for up-to-date information, send questions, learn about the project. How can a homeowner get the most out of this report? And the same question for a business owner. What should they be looking for in this?
So I would say that is a two-part answer. One is to understand the things that are being noted that will guide the update and the way that the direction that the updates are going. And so to understand that, and I think the second part is that it should you should review it at this point in time to assess whether, if you have interfaced with the zoning code in a specific way and you've had a specific experiences with it, that you are denoting those. And if you don't see it present, a challenge that you had, or some input that you've learned through your use of the code, just make sure that it's present within the report, and provide feedback if it's not. I also think, as a third point, that it could be this report can be an opportunity to just educate yourself a little bit. If you're not someone that looks at the zoning code all the time and you're just sort of new to this topic, go into the map, find your property, find your zoning district, maybe go in and just look a little bit at your zoning district and what is entailed there. And there may or may not be specific recommendations in the report about that zoning district. Not every zoning district will change. There's a lot of built out areas in the city, and they may not change, they likely won't change substantially. But just going in and understanding how to navigate the information that's in the code, so that when we get to subsequent parts of this process, you're just a little more familiar than you were before with how to navigate some of the specifics of zoning.
Can you summarize the broad goals of the project, Retool Gaithersburg?
Yeah, so I'm gonna put that into a two-parter. I think that there's a lot of just the sort of the code as a document. People use it. There's a staff at the city that has to administer it. And so that document and the way that document is structured, the language it uses, can kind of dictate how easy to use that it is. And so with Gaithersburg, there's already a lot of things that we can do to just make it a code that's easier to use. So that's one of the goals, is just to make it a document that the community feels comfortable with. And that the information is easy to find, the document is easy to navigate. The second part is, communities have planning departments, communities have land use goals, and and then there's also public engagement, which should always be an ongoing effort in any project like this. And I think that the secondary goal is to strike a balance where the zoning code is respecting the existing development patterns, respecting the existing urban fabric, but also evolving to encapsulate the goals of the community and what the community wants to see in the built environment. So the zoning regulations can especially have an impact that over time. And so that second part is just making sure that the built environment, the zoning code is producing the results that the community wants to see.
Okay. Other questions. How will the recommended changes to procedural requirements affect transparency and community engagement in zoning processes?
So the engagement won't, isn't going, that is not a part that we are going to be affecting. The public engagement requirements are often, quite legal, maybe mandated in the broader municipal code. And so, there will still be, a high degree of engagement, public meeting presentation so the community can weigh in where, the processing of that report will entail community input at several points. Like those things won't be changing substantially. And Rob or Greg, if you want to jump in on this one, just based on sort of existing notifications and public meetings that already take place.
Sure. As Jocelyn mentioned, some things are required by law, but just being a good government organization, we're not out to suppress public engagement, and we fully support transparency and are looking at ways. Really, this procedural thing, as was mentioned by Jocelyn in an earlier part of the presentation, is really trying to look at ways to speed up process, to help people get to what they're trying to achieve through zoning, through plan approvals. Oftentimes, excessive process can be a disincentive to investment, either in fixing up your home or opening a business. So really what we're trying to do is figure out ways to reduce application costs and application time process, but not at the expense of engagement or transparency. We're always, want to make sure we hear from our public, our workers, our residents, our visitors, as we move forward with things. So hopefully that clears up sort of the direction and goal that we're looking at when we talk about, streamlining process.
Well, that dovetails really nicely into the next question. How do these recommendations contribute to increased equity in Gaithersburg? And can you provide any specific example?
So I think that coming out of this process, which was the diagnostic, we're at a place right now where we've assessed the ways that the zoning code is sort of holding back equity or is restraining, and the way that it could be changed to sort of facilitate it better just through removing these provisions that are maybe inhibiting more equitable development process, more equitable development outcomes. So I think right now a lot can be done to just sort of remove those barriers. And then also there's I spoke before about a sort of tangential, that the housing element that is going on right now too, which is looking at the more potential proactive solutions to that. So zoning code really within the scope of this project will be a big part of that, will be removing barriers that we're already starting to see within the code.
And the last question that I have so far, what questions should constituents be asking? Is there anything you've seen in other communities where at this point community members, business owners have been asking that you haven't heard yet?
That's a great question. I will say that this part in the process, it's a lot of, again, it's diagnosed, so we're not necessarily putting a lot of specific, like highly specific updates forward, because they do require some granular study of the built environment and the community goals and things like that. So I wouldn't say that now there's been an absence of anything, but I think in the next portion of the project, when we're putting forth more specific solutions, again, the community is they are the most familiar people. They're with the structure of the community and how the community works and flows. And so I think in that portion, when the solutions are coming forward a little bit more, it'll be important to have feedback in those and to have good questions from the community then. And I think you know, that it always ends up being quite specific to your property and your experience and the places that you shop or the places that you work. So I think thinking really critically about, the zoning districts where you frequent and what is being proposed for those zoning districts and sort of, working through those and providing feedback to the project managers.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have for now. I'd ask Rob or Greg if there's any other notes that you'd want to share or anything else for the folks listening in.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on the end of about 15 minutes left. So if anybody in the audience, has any other questions, please enter them now so we can get to them. Just some quick follow-up stuff, as Jocelyn mentioned, as they get through this diagnostic phase, over the course of the summer, we want to have stakeholder meetings and focus groups and things like that. So if you're out there and you're interested, please, register again through the project page. Also, I posted up in the Q&A section the link to the unique email address. So after tonight's meeting, please feel free to email or issue comments to retool@gaithersburgmd.gov. Especially if you have an issue or if you think there's a topic you would be particularly interested in serving in a focus group about, if that topic comes up for one. Again, we really appreciate everybody giving the time. We encourage you to stay involved, to get your neighbors involved, to get your coworkers involved, to get your bosses involved. Any connection you have to the city of Gaithersburg, zoning touches everyone's lives here, either directly, visibly or indirectly that you may not expect. So the more voices we hear from, the better the final product will be, as Jocelyn was mentioning. We need everybody's input. Us as planners and city staff, we have our own perspectives, we have our own knowledge. But as was mentioned, many of you, are here 24 hours a day. You've been here for years. You've seen changes to the city. So we sort of really need to hear from you. So again, get involved with the project page, sign up for updates, submit questions and answers, sort of track when we have additional public forums, try to get the word out, tell your neighbors, those who couldn't attend tonight to watch this video. It looks like, it's only going to be about 50 minutes, take 50 minutes out of your day to sort of listen to what was being discussed. I'm rambling on a bit. I want to turn it over to see if, Jocelyn has any parting words or Greg has any thoughts.
So, yeah, I think we've really hammered on this one that people should continue to stay updated and stay involved. And again, there's an email address where you can ask questions too. Zoning is dense and can be a challenging topic, so that is also an option for you too. So yeah, I think that is it for me. I know we're finishing a little ahead of schedule. Christopher, did any additional questions come in these final moments?
No, but I did recall there was one question from the earlier session that I think is good to raise, and this actually goes to Rob and Greg. Someone from the earlier session had asked if staff had identified any elements that come up again and again, which could be addressed so that the zoning processes could be smoother. And I don't know, Rob, if that's something that can be addressed in this setting or not.
I think at a very high level, yes, we've known about some of the issues. One of the big ones, and not to make sausage because it's going to be further explored, but it's in the amending of existing schematic development plans or sketch plans. There's two options, and one of the options is meant to sort of expedite the process, but it can actually add 1 to 2 more months of process onto it. So it's things looking at that. It's ways that we can simplify and make it easier for the developer, the homeowner, or the business owner to change or amend plans. Greg can probably speak to some of the Euclidean zones. Sometimes, there's not necessarily super clarity. What is the difference between, concept and preliminary and final, and the submission requirements, and some of the stuff required at different stages maybe doesn't make sense. So, Greg, if you got a quick minute, if you have something to speak to.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have acknowledged there's certain things like in our definitions, what is a structure, what's not. So we definitely acknowledge that. It's something to further explore. To Rob's point about procedural process, we've definitely also looked at things where, right now, the way the code's written, all commercial additions, you have to go to the planning commission for their approval, but residential additions up to a certain square footage can be handled at administrative or staff level. So again, it puts a little more process and a little more time on commercial properties. They're trying to go through, probably most times it can be very minor amendments. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of different aspects of the code that, the planning staff has already acknowledged need to be further looked at and probably cleaned up with this process.
Christopher, from your recollection, is because we have about 10 minutes left, were there any other questions that jump out at you from this afternoon session that may be beneficial to ask this evening?
Yeah, at least one more. An audience member had asked, are there provisions for zoning text amendments in the future, once the code has been updated, that would keep the new code clean and consistent?
Sure. So, as we talked about during the afternoon session, the last time our zoning ordinance was comprehensively looked at was 1965, so almost 60 years ago. And ever since then has been morphed and bandaged and put together and held together with duct tape of zoning text amendments. The world will always change. The real effort of Retool Gaithersburg is to give us this proactive approach to zoning that's really trying to look forward and not have to warrant as many text amendments. The world will constantly change over time, and text amendments are a necessary aspect of that, because as great as ZoneCo is and as smart as our staff is, we can't foresee everything. So there's going to be something that warrants it, but we want to build a strong enough foundation that, this zoning ordinance will be useful for decades to come, that we're not redoing this exercise every 10 years. But that, again, it's not to say there won't be text amendments that aren't warranted over the next 10 years or next 20 years. We're just hoping to minimize them.
Jocelyn, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Rob
Okay.
Rob framed that nicely.
And there was, I think, one more great question that relates to that directly. An audience member had asked, will there be clarity created for some definitions through semantics? And the example that they highlighted was the definition of green area. So what really counts as green area and what does not?
Yes, as Jocelyn mentioned multiple times in her presentation, much at the prodding of city staff, definitions are a huge issue with our zoning ordinance. Clarity is of the utmost importance to us. We want to remove this confusion. We want to establish clear standards as it relates to definitions. Not only what that we're using language that's not confusing, such as green area, which really means open space, which is completely different than green necessarily, because it can be hardscaped. So we want to make sure we're clear in our definitions. We want to be clear on how those definitions are to be applied in the zones. And if there are standards, we want to be clear in what those standards are. So there's not this thing of where you look at an area and go, is it X or is it Y? I really can't tell from the definition. We want to make sure. So this was, one of the main impetuses for beginning Retool, if nothing else, was just to clean up definitions and the like. But, this is built upon. Obviously, Jocelyn, if you have additional thoughts, chime in.
Yeah, no, agreed. Yeah, we looked at some of the definitions in coming in and where they're absent or just sort of odd or contain use standards that are should be in a special use standards section. Those are just some of the things. There's just kind of an array of issues that need to be addressed. So, you know, we'll definitely, that's high on the list of things we've already started working through, understanding exactly where there's duplication, absence of definitions, or definitions that just will need to be revised. So that is something that we've already tried to sort of get our arms around understanding. So, you know, in that, yeah, which was part of the diagnostic review.
Christopher, we have time for maybe one more if you have handy, another question that came from this afternoon session. Otherwise, we will begin once again thanking everyone and signing off a few minutes early.
Yeah, no, I think that covers all of the questions that we had.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, again, folks, thank you for taking an hour out of your evening. Again, I cannot encourage you enough. Please stay involved. Please, you know, help spread the word and get other people involved in this project. It is still will be going on for months ahead. You know, no decisions have been made. No final actions have occurred yet. We've really just gotten over the first big hump. And again, we want to hear from you. Jocelyn, Christopher, Greg, parting thoughts, comments?
Just echoing what you said, again, we appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy schedules to meet with us today, and we look forward to continuing to work with the community as we move through this project.
Yeah, thank you for attending, everybody.
All righty, if that's it, thanks again, everyone. And as I mentioned, transcripts, recordings, etc., should be posted up on the project page next week. Take care and have a great evening.
Great, thank you, everybody.